Well, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're just a few minutes after 10, and we're continuing to have attendees join, but we want to make sure that we've got a lot to cover and that we get through in our planned hours so that you can get back to the rest of your day. We want to thank all of you for joining our TPG webinar series today. My name is Sarah Friend, and I will be hosting today's webinar on data breaches and ID theft, what CFOs and HR professionals need to know. I'm pleased to introduce you this morning to our two co-presenters, Rick Kam, President and Founder of ID Experts, and Craig Pankow, Managing Director of our Commercial Division up at our Bellevue office. So a couple introductory comments about Rick and Craig. So Rick is a certified information privacy professional, which is it sounds like a pretty distinct designation that has a lot of extensive training involved. He has experience leading organizations in the development of policies and solutions to address the growing problem of protecting protected health insurance or health information, PHI, and personally identifiable information, or PII, and then remediating privacy incidents, identity theft, and medical identity theft. Rick leads and participates in several cross-industry data privacy groups, speaks at conferences and webinars on a regular basis, and contributes original articles, including a monthly guest article in Government Health IT, and offers commentary to privacy, data breach risk, and IT publications. He is often quoted as a resource in news articles about medical identity theft, privacy, and data breach. He shared with me as we were getting ready this morning, though, that above all of that, people find it most interesting that he plays ukulele and often sings Tiny Bubbles at social gatherings. So maybe on a different occasion we could hear that, Rick. So Rick, thank you for joining us. Also with us is Craig Pankow. Craig joined the Partners Group in 2016 and has over 30 years of experience under his belt in the insurance field, working with organizations to protect their businesses. So today we are so happy to have Craig really as our expert on how to protect our enterprises when it comes to data breach and identity theft. As many of you know, TPG is a financial insurance services firm here in Oregon, Washington, and Montana. And we often have webinars. Our goal is to have these types of educational, hot topic webinars about once a month for our clients. And so before we kick off, I'll just do a couple of housekeeping items and then we'll get started. All attendees will be on mute since we have such a large audience with us today. We want to make sure that we get through the content. But I would encourage you to please go ahead and use the question box in the GoToWebinar toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. This will allow you to record your questions and give our team an opportunity to follow up with you within the next week and send you a response via email to those questions. This webinar has also been approved for 1 hour of HRCI and SHRM credits. So our team will be emailing you your certificate along with copies of the slides and the recorded webinar within the next week. So let's jump right into the agenda. This is a very interesting topic that affects all of us. So no matter what hat you're wearing this morning, as an individual, as the head of your family, as a CFO, president, or HR professional, this topic hits close to home for all of us. We've really broken up the presentation into two parts. Rick is going to lead part one. So Rick is going to talk about the risk and impact of data breaches and identity theft on individuals. He's also going to talk about a really interesting topic of the new threat of medical ID theft and the risk to self-funded health plans. We've got a ton of CFOs and HR professionals on the line with us this morning, and this is just a really fascinating and alarming new trend. and then getting to how to protect yourself, and in the role of, your business role, how to help protect your employees. After Rick gets through part 1, then we're going to shift gears, and Craig Pankow is going to take part 2. And part 2 of the webinar is all about the risk and impact of data breaches to businesses. And so he'll walk through understanding insurance coverage to protect your business. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rick, and I'll let you drive part 1.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, for having me at the Partners Group webinar. I appreciate the opportunity to share some information with your clients and your prospects. And what I'm hoping is that at the end of our session today, that between Craig and I, we're able to impart 1 or 2 things that you can take back to your companies, back to your families, that will help you do a better job at reducing the risk of falling victim to identity theft or medical fraud, as well as protecting your businesses and your clients. So with that, let me jump right into the topic. This whole issue of identity theft, when we came on the scene as a company 14 years ago, it was for the most part committed by people who were taking convenience checks out of recycling bins, stealing information out of people's cars that might include their registrations, or stealing mail out of mailboxes in front of your homes. Right around 2005, the whole complexion of identity theft started to change based on a new threat vector, which essentially was organized crime getting involved. And we started to see this explosive growth of data breaches, as you see on this chart here behind me. TJ Maxx was one of the first very large breaches, followed by Heartland Payment Systems, where literally 130 million credit cards were stolen. You see, as you move towards the further right in terms of time, a shift to Target and Anthem, eBay, the Office of Personnel Management, Home Depot, Ashley Madison, and others were affected. Literally, last year, over 1,000 breaches were reported in the news. And when you think about that, in that context, that means there are roughly 3 major breaches that affect people in the U.S. and people around the world every day being reported. The major shift, though, that's occurring happened right around 2 years ago. 2015 was actually one of the largest, I guess you could say, shifts in terms of threat vectors. What was happening was, as opposed to organized crime, we were starting to see nation states involved in stealing personnel records and personal information. And we saw that initially with Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield Anthem. If you remember that particular situation, roughly 78 million electronic health records have been stolen, allegedly by the Chinese government. 2 weeks later, Premera up in Washington announced that they had seen a similar attack, again by the Chinese government, and roughly 10 or 11 million electronic health records were stolen at that point. About a month later, CareFirst in Maryland reported 1.1 million records stolen by the Chinese government. And then Excelius in New York, Blue Cross Blue Shield Excelius, reported a similar attack, resulting in a similar loss of electronic health records. During that same year, we saw the Office of Personnel Management, which is the largest HR department in the U.S., disclose, starting in April, that they had seen a cyber attack, again from the Chinese government, and roughly 4.6 million personnel records were stolen. And these are people who are either work for the federal government or are retirees, or have some benefits associated with the federal government as an employee. When the breach was disclosed in April, some of us probably watched on TV. There was a congressional hearing on the topic. The secretary at the time, Archetta, was being asked about what the cause of the breach was and what the impact was. And during the course of these hearings and the further investigation, they realized that they had actually a larger problem. The background investigation records, roughly 21.7 million background investigation records from this large HR department, was actually also affected, again, by the Chinese government going off with this data, stealing this data. And if you think about why people get background investigations done, it's essentially to access secure work sites like naval bases, as an example, or to get secure access to systems. If you work for the FBI, Secret Service, NSA, one of those agencies with 3 digits, you need to access very secure information sites, if you will. And then also if you have very specific jobs, like the President of the United States, congressmen on the Hill, their staffs, federal judges, people who work for TSA, people who are federal contractors working in corporations like Boeing or like IBM, right? People that are working in those types of situations, working in the federal government, all need the background check. And the net of it was all that information was stolen, including 5.6 million full sets of fingerprints. So you can imagine the amount of data that's now been released starting in 2015, roughly 152 million electronic medical records, the background investigation records of some of the most critical national security resources that protect our country. And literally the most recent breach, if you go to the next slide, Sarah, was one where one of the 3 credit bureaus in the U.S. was hit. 145.5 million credit records were stolen, again, allegedly by the Chinese government. So, one might wonder, what's going on. And the net of it is, electronic information stored around our credentials is access not only to our financial information, but literally everything we value. So whether it's your financial accounts that you have stored with financial institutions, or now HSA, health savings accounts that you have stored because of high deductible health plans, or access to various websites to protect our pets, our cars, our homes, home security. And everything is secured through our identity, our credentials. And unfortunately, over the last 2 or 3 years, since nation states have gotten involved, and those nation states specifically are China. I mentioned them multiple times. You've heard in the news Russia has been involved with a variety of cyber attacks around our elections. Syria, Iran, North Korea are the main perpetrators today of a lot of cyber attacks and a lot of cyber crime. And so that's basically what's happening. If you go to the next slide. So one of the things that results from this is identity theft. And there are multiple forms. We're going to talk about the 9 forms of identity theft here shortly. But the problem is, when you have your data breached, you are roughly 3 to 4 times more likely to fall victim to identity theft than someone who's not had their data breached. And unfortunately, due to the Equifax breach, roughly 1 in 2 employees in the U.S., there's how many of us in this room? 5. 3 of us have had our data disclosed by Equifax at this point, just in this room alone. And I imagine as you poll your employees, as you poll your families, and they look at whether or not they've been affected, you'll see roughly half of them have been affected by this particular problem. And so this is affecting everybody today, all families, all employees. And 15.6 million people fell victim to identity theft last year alone, which was a 15% increase in the victimization of people who are hit by this problem. The number of data breaches is at an all-time high. It's actually increased 40% year over year over the last 2 years. And so this problem doesn't look like it's going away, and in fact, it looks like it's actually becoming more serious. So where is this information going? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what the risk is of this information being disclosed. There's an area of the web that is not indexed by Google called the dark web. And it's not that it's dark, it's just that it's not indexed by the search engines we all use. It is indexed by search engines, for example, like the Onion Rod or Tor, as an example, which was developed by academia to help exchange information. But it happens now to be used by organized crime and nation states to essentially exchange information and search information in the dark web. And as you can see here from this particular slide, there are lots of things that may be traded on the dark web, whether it's illegal information, whether it's credit card information, whether it's your health, electronic health records. There's a lot of information being traded that we as regular visitors to the web don't have any visibility to. One of those things, though, and Sarah touched on this when she opened the session, is electronic medical records. And it turns out one of the most valuable forms of illicit data today is your electronic medical record. And if you can imagine what's in that record, right, it's not only your financial information, but it's your health insurance. It's information about your health history, your prescription history, your procedures, and so forth. It's enough information to essentially commit not only financial identity theft, but medical fraud, which is really the financial reward, if you will, for using electronic medical records for bad actors. It's medical fraud. And if you think about the amount of revenue associated in the U.S. with medical services, I've heard the number nearing $3 trillion, a number that's very hard to imagine what that number sounds like. But somewhere between 3 and 10% of that number is identified by the FBI as medical fraud. And that number is somewhere between $70 and $200 billion of losses associated with this number, with this various type of crime. And what are they doing with it? We've all heard of the opioid problem that the U.S. is facing. Medical identity theft is a contributing factor to that. So someone using your health insurance number to go down, up and down the I-5 freeway to the various pharmacies to get access to opioids and then sell them in the dark web, right, is one of the more serious problems. The other, quite honestly, is getting access to either other health care that their plans don't provide for, or to sell those health insurance numbers to people who don't have health insurance, who need access to services. And so it propagates an interesting problem it presents an interesting problem for people who have their health insurance information compromised. And that basically is in this one example, there's a situation where a mother has someone use her health insurance essentially to give birth in another hospital, not the person herself, but someone using her health insurance essentially to get birthing services. It turns out she happened to be on meth, so the baby was identified as a meth baby. And by Health and Human Services doing their job, basically when they realized this, they basically went to the real Sarah and took away her children, because that's what Health and Human Services does. In this particular situation, Sarah, it took her months essentially to clear up the situation, but you can only imagine the frustration and agony that she went through while HHS is basically taking away her children. Right? The other more common problem, quite honestly, is someone using your medical identity, your health insurance, to get access to illegal drugs or prescription drugs, as an example. The problem with the common patient, if you will, is that your medical record now will start to include aspects of the other people's medical activity. So when they go to the doctor, they get a prescription, get a blood test, all of a sudden your electronic medical record starts to reflect somebody else's medical data. And if you can imagine, the problem with this is because if you go into an emergency room and you're not coherent, if you will, the doctors are relying on your electronic medical record to give you a transfusion, to medicate you, and so forth. And unfortunately, medical identity has a horrible side effect of potentially being a safety risk to health and safety. And this is not the case with financial identity theft, where someone uses your social security number to get a credit card. Someone using a fake credit card will not kill you. Medical identity theft could. That's the problem. Right? So where does this data go? Unfortunately, once the information is available, it starts to be traded in the dark web. And as you can see from this particular slide, the value of this data, in this case, 48,000 patient records, is roughly 151.96 bitcoins, $150,000 for those medical records. And unfortunately, this page shows that it's easily accessible and easy to acquire using essentially non-traceable forms of currency called Bitcoin.
Is that so, Rick? That's how business is transacted in the dark web through Bitcoin.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in a very much Amazon-like fashion.
Mm-hmm. So the buy it now.
Buy it now.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's talk now. We're going to switch gears a little bit. We've talked about why this data is available. Now I want to talk about how you actually identify whether or not you've fallen victim to identity. That's number one. But more specifically, how do you reduce the risk of falling victim to this? So this information will be useful for you as an individual, as a parent, as an employee of a company, and as HR and risk managers, if you will, to try to reduce this risk happening to employees in your organization. So there are 9 types of identity theft. I'm not going to go through every one of them because most of them will be familiar to you, like financial identity theft. Child identity theft is actually problematic because it turns out roughly 30% of all identity theft be false children. And the reason for that is because their social security numbers are not necessarily used until they go to college, right? Or they rent an apartment or some variation on the theme. And so the identity thieves have a full 18 years to use that social security number without being caught. Right? And so unfortunately, one of the more targeted populations is children's identity and social security numbers. We talked about medical identity theft. One of the more interesting problems that occurs, or will start occurring here shortly, is where a bad actor will use your social security number essentially to file your tax returns on your behalf, with the refunds, if you will, going to their specified location. And unfortunately, this problem is pervasive during the beginning of the year. Literally, millions of fraudulent tax returns are submitted on behalf of U.S. citizens by fraudsters from January, beginning of the year till April, to the tune of roughly $21 billion of losses out of the IRS system. And unfortunately, when this happens to you as a victim, when you submit your tax return to the IRS, they'll basically tell you that you've already submitted a return, so don't expect a tax return back. And once you identify that this is actually a form of identity theft, they will help you. The IRS will help you try to recover the problem, but it'll take somewhere between 6 and 9 months to solve this. So if you're expecting a fast return, it's not going to happen if you fall victim to this particular problem. Let's go to the next slide. So we're going to get into a few things that you as an individual can do to reduce your risk. And I'm going to mention a few things. If you do any one of these actions, you will significantly reduce your risk of falling victim to identity theft. So listen really closely, and if you have questions, I'll post them on the Q&A, and Sarah and I will follow back and make sure we answer your questions here. But there's been several versions of antivirus software out there for years. Norton Security has been out there for literally years and years and years. And basically what this software does, it looks for bad, basically malicious software being installed on your machine. And it turns out, if you're surfing the internet, if you're receiving email, if you're exchanging text messages, unfortunately, even at this point, there may be a situation where a bad actor has loaded a piece of code in that email or in that on that link that you click on that will essentially infect your machine and cause it to essentially release information, whether it's your social security number, your bank account numbers, other information you don't want disclosed. Like it could be your corporate chart of accounts if you're the CFO, or some other variation on the theme. So one of the first things you want to do, whether you have a laptop or an Apple Mac or other variation, is to make sure that you have an antivirus solution turned on. Many of the systems today come with them. Macs, for example, come with something called File Vault, which will encrypt and secure your Mac. But the key is you have to turn it on. And so you'll see several variations of products on this particular screen, including one called Avast for Mac. And select one of those or one that you find on, from Amazon or somewhere else, and install that. There's also other variations that deal with malware, specifically adware. So have you ever wondered why when you click on like something you want to buy on the internet, like a new bicycle or maybe a new car or a Sonos sound system or some variation. All of a sudden, every website you go to shows you a copy of that ad, if you will, as you visit various websites. Well, the problem is adware. And what happens is when you click on an ad for a particular product or a particular service, those advertisers load a piece of software on your browser that will follow you around as you visit various places on the web. And so one of the things you want to install is an adware, malware product, also to strip that from your systems. And of course, now most of us are doing a lot of this on our phones, and there's quite a few products now available for both adware and malware and antivirus for your phones. And you see a list of those there. This particular chart is a little bit of an eye test. We don't want you to read this chart necessarily, but the point of it is those little devices in your homes each of us have now called Wi-Fi routers. Most of them come out of the box unsecured, meaning that you turn them, you take them out of the box. Most people plug them directly in, and they don't configure them to be secure. And so what all this is on this particular chart is a set of instructions that you can hand to your grandson or somebody that's just graduated from college, like Zach here, who has the time to essentially secure that router so that your neighbors, people that are driving by your home, fraudsters and others will not have access to your Wi-Fi network and all the devices in your home, and make sure that they're secure. Next slide. The other thing that most people don't think about is actually including something called a virtual private network. A few years ago, this was only available to people in business, or if you called Comcast or some variation on the team, and an IT professional would come out and install this particular solution in order to protect the data that was traversing between your laptop and your corporate systems. Today, a VPN is available for pretty much anybody. You can go off and select a product and have it installed, and install it yourself, quite honestly. And it will protect both your phones as well as your laptops. So I recommend, if you don't do anything else, look into putting a virtual private network on your phone, as an example. And what that does is it encrypts all communications between your phone and everything, period. So that if someone is listening on your phone or has tapped a Wi-Fi in a Starbucks, the data is all encrypted. And if you're an HR professional in particular, or a CFO, you want to make sure that that data is not accessed and leaked, breached, if you will. And this is one way to do that, one good way. The last, I think this might be the last slide I have, but the other issue, people, have been pounded by their IT professionals to use strong and secure passwords. And the problem with that is it turns out every website we visit, every place we go now asks us for a secure password. And it's really hard to remember these, 6 to 8 digits with, special characters, and especially if you have to change them every few months. And so there are password managers, this piece of software you can install on your phone and your laptop that will remember these complex passwords. So you only have to remember one. And it will help essentially secure all of your devices, all the places you visit. And more importantly, when you go to all these places again, it'll remember those passwords for you. So you don't have to try to, in my case, I'll ask my wife first, which of my many passwords I've used or not used on a various website. And most times I have to reset my password, unfortunately. But this allows you to make sure that you're using a strong password and you can remember it. Actually, I do have one more slide. So one last question I typically get, being in the identity protection business, is how do I select an identity protection product, because they all look the same? And the answer to that is yes, they do look very similar. In fact, the first generation of identity protection products pretty much were all the same. So whether you went with LifeLock or other, with one of the credit bureaus or with us as an example, the features of those programs were very similar. In fact, if you look at the top of this slide, the primary component that is looking to detect identity theft is tools like credit monitoring and public records monitoring, and basically monitoring tools to detect whether your information is being disclosed. And none of it is There's only 3 credit bureaus in the U.S. There's public records sources. All of the companies, all in this identity protection industry, use the same data. And so for the most part, there's no difference in terms of monitoring tools, like in the first generations of products. There is differences when you start to look at what's insured. So all of you who have worked with the Partners Group know that all insurance is not alike, and that you need to look at the fine print to know what you're getting. And one example of this is whether or not electronic funds transferred out of your accounts are covered. And so in some cases, they'll say there's a sublimit, if you will, up to $1 million. In other cases, the sublimits are lower. So if you're concerned about electronic funds transfers, look at the sublimits, right? And so you start to see differences there. Identity theft recovery is an important component. If you fall victim to identity theft, it's good that the monitoring tools detect it, but if you don't actually recover from it, then it's not helpful. And so you always want to look to make sure that there's identity theft recovery services as part of a product. And then you'll see unique features. In our case, medical identity claims monitoring is one of the things that we provide. We have a patent on that. Other companies like LifeLock will monitor your savings and investment accounts. Experian, as an example, will set up a credit lock, like a credit freeze on your credit. And then there's pricing. In our case, we have both individual and family pricing. In other cases, every person is an individual, so you have to buy an individual membership. And the last thing I'll mention is look at the terms and conditions, because it turns out the small print in terms and conditions, even though we all bypass this, is really important. It turns out many companies in their terms and conditions will ask you for the right to sell and use your data. And if you're trying to protect yourself from identity theft, it's kind of an oxymoron. So make sure that the company you work with does not put that in as a right when you sign the terms and conditions. That's it.
And Rick, the retail monthly cost, those examples are examples of what it would cost an individual who's buying this on a direct basis from any one of these 3 companies, correct?
That's correct.
And do each of these 3 companies also offer group voluntary products that would be offered, that a business could offer on a voluntary basis to their employees through payroll deductions?
They do, yeah. Each of these companies and more offer, an employee benefits configuration. So it's something that would be good to be looked into if you're concerned about this.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for covering the risk to individuals. That was fascinating and scary all at the same time. So we're going to transition now to Craig Pankow. So Craig is going to cover part 2 of our webinar today and really shift to protecting our businesses. So we've got a lot of CFOs on the line and risk managers and presidents of companies. So I think this is also going to be equally interesting. Craig, are you on the line?
I am on the line. And thank you for taking time this morning, everyone, to discuss this important topic. I'm actually remote, so I'm going to ask Sarah to flip slides, and what we're going to talk about is we're going to start with taking a look at your company risk. And so what we're trying to determine is the various factors that could influence your risk and whether or not you have an exposure. Does your business retain physical or electronic records of the following? And you can see from the list: social security numbers, driver's license information, tax ID, birth dates, medical health records, court records, police records, banking information, of course, checking and saving, and email addresses. Now, a lot of business, most business will have this kind of information. And the next slide, if you check yes to any item on the previous slide, your organization, as Rick mentioned, is in control of personally identifiable information and required to protect the data subject to state and federal privacy and data breach notification laws. And we did a little PPG poll question. We had, looks like 67 responded, and 65 of the 67 said that your business does retain those records. So we almost all have an exposure just from this particular incident. Next slide, please. Does your employees have business? Does your business have employees? Seems like sort of a simple question, but many data breaches involve an employee mistake. They lose a mobile device, laptop, or paper records, or make costly errors with opening an unauthorized email. Some of the largest claims that I'm aware of have resulted from lost laptops and the data that can be available on them. So the more employees you have, the more points of access people have to getting your information. Next slide, please. Does your business have an active website? Now, most of us have websites. Most of them, in some way or another, are active. Now, it may be just for information, but if you have a website that is transactional, it creates an additional exposure, including possible hacking or disruption of your business via denial of service attacks. So the website creates additional exposure. Does your business use third-party vendors, example, cloud services? Now, this is actually an important item to discuss because if you're the owner of the data, your business is ultimately responsible for that data. And one of the questions we had been asked was, what unique risks are there to self-funded plans? And I think this may be one of the risks, because in a unique risk to a self-funded plan is you have a higher degree of responsibility. You have a fiduciary responsibility. Even if you hire out a TPA or someone to help you administer it, it's still your data. So you have a higher responsibility for that data. And that's the unfortunate thing here. If you're using a cloud or another provider, if they have a breach and it accesses your data, you can be, like I said, ultimately responsible. So it's important to take time in selecting vendors, to take a close look at the contracts. Now, depending on your leverage with that provider, you may or may not be able to get them to change some of the provisions, but it is important to review. Next slide, please. Kind of related to an earlier slide, does your business accept credit card payments or other electronic payments or have online bill pay? Interesting stat here from Net Diligence is over 25% of all data stolen is credit card and other payment information. And obviously that makes sense. It's highly desirable in the black market, and it's almost everyone has a credit card. Next slide, please. Does your business allow employees to use personal devices to connect to your network? And this is a tough one for us all. You know, personal devices may not have the same security software and other connectivity procedures as company-provided devices. Certainly here at the Partners Group, we have a large number of people that have iPhones and other mechanisms from home or other portable devices to connect. And we do that so that we provide a great service to our customers. But the more that employees use those devices, the more susceptible you would be. And in our survey question here, it looks like we had 67 people respond, and 44 of the 67 said that they allowed employees to use personal devices. And that little survey question is a nice reference for your peers on the line. Does your business train employees on proper email use and other privacy issues? Well, again, not a surprise. Employee negligence and or errors are one of the top 3 contributors of lost stolen data. Email procedures and processes and training is an important aspect. Some of the carriers that I'm going to be talking about and coverages we'll be talking about here in a moment, those insurance companies can provide some of that training. And in our survey, looks like we have 68 respond, and 47 said that they do provide email training. All right, next slide, please. Does your business store your customers' corporate confidential information? And again, piggybacking on the earlier slides, but companies face liabilities for failing to protect their customers and business partners' confidential information. Next slide. All right, a story by the numbers. You know, Rick had lots of numbers. I don't have as many, so I have a few here. But 55% of small business owners experienced a cyber attack in the past 12 months. And I bring that up and attach that bullet just because you would think that it would be mostly large companies attacked. But smaller firms may not have the same security as the larger firms, so they too are vulnerable to an attack. only 14% of the companies that rate their ability to mitigate a cyber attack as highly effective. So I think we're all aware that we could do more. 47% of data breaches are caused by a malicious or criminal attack. And then just a few other numbers here. Accidental release of private data by an employee accounted for 25% of data breaches in 2016, while IT glitches and other business process failures were the cause of 28% of the time. So some good numbers, but to keep in mind the exposure. So now the cost of a data breach. And there's lots of costs, and I only have, 20, 25 minutes here to speak. So I hope you'll allow me the grace to hit on some of the major ones. Forensic examination to determine the scope. It's actually one of the most important coverages that you want to have, and the expense associated with determining why the breach took place, especially in a complex organization, can be difficult, and the breach could have been taking place for 6 months or a year. Then, of course, you have the notification of affected customers and other parties. You have payments to a call center to handle all the customer questions. Of course, Rick mentioned credit or identity monitoring, public relations, all the information that is out there and trying to manage those public relations. Of course, legal defense is always part of these defenses. Lawsuits will follow. Regulatory penalties are proceedings we'll talk about a bit more, but this is a big item as well and complex. Of course, time element losses, business interruption losses, and loss of damage to data/property, and liability for denial of service from or access to data. Those are just a few of the costs. The list could go on for multiple slides, but I think this starts to give you the idea of some of the major ones. Cost of a data breach. Just to make you all feel good, the per record cost of a data breach averaged $141 in 2017. And then Sarah, I don't know if you can click up the others. But that varies, I'm sorry, go back. Yeah, that varies by industry. You'll see healthcare, for example, is $380, financial services at $245, you have transportation, $123, and services, $223. I mean, you can see how it varies by industry. So one of the questions that we're going to get, or we always get, and it's a very difficult one, and I don't know that there's always a good answer, what kind of limit do I need? Well, I think it always has to start with your industry. Understanding your industry, healthcare has a different exposure per record than retail might. And then the other aspect you want to keep in, you start with your industry, and then you consider how many records you have that can be accessed or possibly accessed. You can kind of start with that as basic math. Another good way is to take a look at the cyber application. That application will force you to go through the various aspects of the cyber coverage and where you may need protection. But as just an initial start point, you can start with the average cost and number of records with the understanding it's hard to predict how high could be. Next slide, please. Cost of lost business continued. While the average direct cost of data breaches is high, the cost of lost business can be higher, more than $4.1 million on average. And they include abnormal customer turnover, increased customer acquisition costs, reputation loss, negative publicity, and diminished goodwill. Now this would take into account all data and would include some of the huge breaches that we've seen. But I think one of the elements not to forget and to remember as you're evaluating your own exposure is what's my business interruption exposure. Next slide, please. So the risk of attack. According to confirmed breaches in 2016, the likelihood of a cyber attack differs among industries and business. No surprise. Here are the four most vulnerable. Thought you'd find it interesting. Financial services, retail, healthcare, and public sector. And I think as you think about it, it makes good sense. Those are the industries where there could be some very valuable information, especially healthcare, financial sectors. Retail, I think it's just everywhere, so that's just a normal target. Next slide, please. So state requirements. Just to make your life easy, there are 48 states require notification of data breaches. And unfortunately, there is no overarching rule or requirement of the data breaches, so the states can vary. And that's one of the complicated things with respect to a data breach. If you have a breach, you'll have a responsibility for your state of domicile and all the states where your customers have locations. And that's one of the things that insurance coverage is helpful with, because no normal person is going to have that information off the top of their head. Next slide. So sample coverages. So this was a difficult slide for me to start. I had started to go down the road, I guess, the rabbit hole of giving you the 13 types of insuring agreements within cyber, but then I thought everyone would hang up on me. So I'm borrowing a concept from my friends at AIG, and they're going to talk, so I'll talk high level about the types of claims, the types of losses, and I'm going to segregate it between a financial loss and an actual tangible property loss or bodily injury. So, of course, you can cover third-party loss resulting from a security breach. That includes defense cost and damages if the business or its outsourced handling firm, which we discussed earlier, causes a breach of personal or corporate data. Defense costs and damages if the business contaminates someone else's data with a virus. Defense costs and damages if the business suffers a theft of system access code by non-electronic means. Can you get that one up there, sir? Oh, there it is. And of course, associated with this, there can be fines or penalties. And one thing, before I go on the other slides on this, one thing to keep in mind about cyber that does make it unique is there's no standardized forms. You know, you talk about, commercial general liability, property insurance, they've been around forever. Cyber insurance is really just starting in the early 2000s. The forms are not standardized. The carriers all offer different products. Generally, you're purchasing the coverages sort of like a cafeteria plan, selecting the various products. Some will combine. So when you're comparing forms, it can be a little hard to compare because they're not uniform. Next slide, please. So some more coverages with respect to the event and managing the cyber event management, and that's the cost of notifications, public relations, and other services to mitigate a cyber incident, expenses to restore, recreate, recollect lost electronic data, forensic investigations, legal consultations, and identity monitoring costs for breach victims. We talked about that on several different occasions. So network interruption or business interruption includes loss of net profit and extra expense as a result of material interruption to the insured's network. Now you'll notice that it's net profit loss because they're going to compensate you for your net loss, so that would be your gross sales less expenses. Then it also includes cyber and privacy extortion, ransom payments to third parties incurred to try to terminate a security or privacy threat. This is another item. It's a little bit like kidnapping ransom, for lack of a better analogy. If someone's got your data, you want an expert to negotiate with them to try to get that data back. And then digital media liability, damages and defense costs incurred in connection with a breach of third-party intellectual property or negligence in connection with electronic content. So tangible losses. Tangible losses, and again, I'm doing this high level and broad just to give you a rough idea, and then have to address specifics later on. That would be tangible, physical, or bodily injury claims. Business interruption, a tangible business loss there would be coverage business income and loss expenses to reduce a loss as a result of a breach involving property damage. First-party property damage. Now that first-party property damage it isn't provided by all the carriers, so keep that in mind. It can be to computers, it can be for your software, and your property forms may or may not provide the level of protection that might be needed in a data breach. Third-party bodily injury and property damage. I put this one in kind of as a harbinger or a note of things that possibly to come. It's a new coverage really just within the last 3 years. And what that provides is bodily injury and property damage to a third party. You would think your general liability policy should and probably will respond to it, but as the security breaches expand and become more prevalent, you have to start to watch to make sure that exclusions don't slip in. For example, if you're a hospital and you have a system that monitors your heart or someone's heart, and the data is breached and your system is breached and it causes you to shut down and somebody dies, you would think you would look to your GL policy, but in the future it's possible that you'll see those exclusionary wording creep in. So I wanted to let you know it's available. Keep it in your mind as you review going forward. And AIG, for example, will write this coverage, difference in conditions in excess over anything you have. Products and completed operations coverage, and that covers bodily injury or property damage caused by a breach of a computer system that is part of the insurance product. Again, it should be protected by your general liability policy. Keep it in mind as you go forward. It is available today. And I have an example here in a couple of slides. Maybe the most important thing you get from, I believe, an insurance company in this is risk consultation and prevention before a breach. Depending on your corporate size, you'll have information made available by the carriers on their websites and other webinars. And if you're of large enough size, you'll see an actual loss control person come out and talk to you about your company. IT consultancy for the business during and after a cyber breach, very important. We talked about the 50 states or 48 states with notification laws. You need someone to help you navigate through and let you know what are the best things to do and what's the best way to proceed to mitigate the claim. And then consultancy to safeguard and rebuild company's reputation after a cyber breach, also very important. So I did a little, actually I borrowed a little cost grid example, I should say, here from my friends at AIG, just to kind of show you how multiple aspects of this coverage can work. The little grid, it shows the tangible and the financial losses on a first-party and third-party basis. In this particular example, what happened is there was someone hacked into electric company's system. They caused a power outage for hundreds of thousands of customers. And then just to show you how the various aspects of the cyber can respond is purchased. So in the financial aspect, you'll have response costs, legal, public relations, data restoration, lost revenue. Tangible, you may have damaged your equipment with the breach. And then in the third party, there could be contractual liabilities for not supplying the power, or you can face, of course, civil fines or penalties. Next slide, please. Okay, and then here's another example, bodily injury and products, completed operations coverage, kind of talking about the one to be aware of, but I thought it was interesting because it's coming. This relates to demonstrated ability to hack vehicles of major auto manufacturer. White hat hackers demonstrated their ability to remotely take control of a vehicle. No injuries resulted, but it demonstrated the potential for a cyber attack against products linked to the internet. And in this particular example, then you'd have coverages for investigation expenses. How did it happen? What can we do to prevent it? Public relations and other event response expenses. And had someone been injured as a result of the software or the product not being properly secured, that could have resulted in a bodily injury or property claim. A couple of actual claims examples, again from my friends at AIG. Email server and external hard drive were stolen from the premises of an outside vendor. Personal information of approximately 175,000 individuals were compromised. And here the carrier worked closely with the insured and provided reimbursement of $1 million for notification and retention of professionals. Next slide, yes. And this is an insured hospital was notified of a potential HIPAA breach involving protected health information of over 40,000 patients. Kind of our worst nightmare, right? So the insurance company engaged quickly. This is an important aspect you need an expert to work with the insured to retain breach counsel and the further retention of a forensic investigator. Based on the ensuing investigation, they coordinated with the insured and the breach counsel on the selection and retention of vendors to handle the required notification to regulators and patients, offered patients access to identity monitoring protection, and established a call center to help inquiries and registration for identity monitoring protection. All very important steps. And then in the next slide, you'll see that the insurance company reimbursed the insured $450,000 for credit monitoring and ID theft, $175,000 in notification and call center costs, $25,000 in forensic, $90,000 in legal, and the policy also covered $500,000 in regulatory fines assessed on the insured. So that is my presentation for today. A few takeaway points, like Rick and Sarah said before. If you have any questions, please email them in. We'll take a look and try to respond to you promptly. And then also, if you had some real concerns about your cyber, we also, as a complimentary basis, and we're not your broker now, wanted to take a look, we could do that as well. Other than that, Sarah, I'm back to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Rick and Craig, for both of your perspectives and for being our experts this morning to walk us through a really complex topic. For everybody who attended, we just want to thank you for your time this morning. And again, if anything triggered a follow-up action, if you're interested in looking at how you can protect your employees, your self-funded health plan, your family, your household, your business, so all of that information that Craig covered, feel free to, while it's still fresh on your mind, just use the question topic. Those aren't going to be published broadly to all attendees, but it's a really fast way to get a request specifically to our team so we can follow up with all of you. Again, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, we will be following up with HRCI credit certificates and an email with a copy of today's presentation so that you can have that for your reference and share it with the rest of your team. So thank you again, all of our attendees, and to Rick and Craig. And that concludes our webinar this morning, and we hope all of you have a wonderful Thanksgiving break next week. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.